Mitch Mitchell became one of the country's leading experts in visual effects, working after he left the BBC for companies like Cinesite, where he was head of imaging for films including the Harry Potter series. He talks about his early childhood in Northern Ireland and how, in the 1950s, watching BBC programmes, he developed a fascination for how they were made. In a long diversion, he explains how programmes like the Coronation and the Quatermass experiments were captured for posterity at a time when there was no electronic recording at all.
From a very early age, circumstances created in my mind some sort of framework or model that meant I ended up doing what I did. I mean, I don't think that it can be a coincidence that I'm the only person of my age who I know who saw the Quatermass experiment when it went out. Now, the Quatermass experiment was the first of Nigel Neal's four Quatermass stories. And the reason it came to exist was because the BBC, prior to the Coronation, were a very amateur organisation. They had tiny studios up at Alexandra Palace, and they were very limited and just sort of odd actors that came from the West End and gave little talks and acted bits out of Shakespeare or whatever. And it was totally amateur, and they had about 10,000 viewers who were in the radius of the Alexandra Palace transmitter. But the BBC, the government wanted the BBC to open up and actually be able to supply this to the length and breadth of the country. So they had a second transmitter at Crystal Palace in London, and then they had another one somewhere in the Midlands, which were available. And then they got on stream a whole lot more, and it was over a few years they worked on this, but they basically decided that they would only have test transmissions up to the Coronation, and in these areas with new transmitters, that their first transmission would be the Coronation. So it'd be a real thing. People could get their sets working with these test transmissions that were just, test cards and bowls of fruit with music playing and stuff like that. And I lived in Belfast in Northern Ireland, and my dad had a small linen factory there. And so, like everybody, television in Northern Ireland, particularly such a kind of royalist place as that, the first programme really was the Coronation. Yeah. And my dad bought a TV which had something like a 12-inch screen or something, and all businesses shut down on the day of the Coronation. And what he did was like a lot of others, and on the floor in the factory he put a dais up at the end with the television, this tiny little television on it, and they had trestle tables with sandwiches and cakes and all sorts of stuff, and all the staff were able to drift in and out and have free food and watch the Coronation on this television. Not that many people could get in front of it. No. So anyway, that was all set up, and the Coronation took place. Now, so there's two sides to this. There's the personal one and there's the BBC one. So the BBC had a serious problem based on this, because the day before the Coronation, they had maybe 100,000 viewers in total, because it had grown from the 10,000. But the production was still based on, like, they only had 10,000 viewers. But the day after Coronation, they had 5 million. Their next door neighbours would come in and watch the telly and all that. So there was a big audience. And they had to go into a more professional thing. And obviously, at this time, they'd already started buying land, and they bought the Lime Grove Studios to do proper production and all that. But they immediately had to think wider. Now, they still only had the Alexandra Palace, and they were only broadcasting so many hours a day. But they suddenly had to have proper stuff. And so they had to commission drama. So their first serial that they commissioned was the Quatermass experiment. That went out just over a month after the Coronation, and this was still in the days of live. Yes. So when they showed it again, they had to do the whole thing again. So there was no recording. No. Now, except, and this is a bit irrelevant from my days at the BBC, but it is an early BBC story, so I think it's fair enough to tell. If you go online, you can buy, or on and off view on iPlayer, you can see Quatermass experiment, because when they did the Coronation, now they didn't have recorders at that stage, but the powers that be, and I thought this was very enlightened, thought in the future people would be very interested to see what the actual show on the day was like, and including the mistakes. And they wanted to hear Richard Dimbleby's description of it live, and they wanted to, and if there was miscuts and things, people would be interested in seeing what was it like for somebody then. And people would want to see the whole 5 hours, what it was like, and what the cutaways were, and what the announcers were like, and what were the announcers wearing, and all that. So they decided that they had to create a means of recording it. So what they did was they basically got the 2 best monitors that they had, and they set them up with fast pull down 35mm cameras.
Yep.
And they set them up, and they had 2, because obviously they had to do changeovers. So they'd have one camera running,
Yes.
and then they're changing the film on the other one, and then they'd run it, and then they'd stop the other one and change the film.
Yes.
And they were able to record the whole thing. And this was an early version of tele-recording. Very crude, but it did the job. And they then left this apparatus up, obviously it was a time before they were going to dismantle it, and they wanted to build a full one. And they, a company called Mekau, which I think was Telefunken, but I don't know. But anyway, a German company was going to build them a proper purpose-built version of this, where they could improve the screens, and and the lens could be an appropriate lens for the thing, and all that stuff. And so they were going to build this Mekau machine. So the original installation was left up so the engineers could measure it and play with it and experiment with it. And when Rudy Cartier came to do Quatermass, they said, well, this is our first commissioned drama, and it's a serial, and people aren't going to cotton on necessarily. They thought of it a different way from people do now, and I think a very sensible way. They said it's going to be word of mouth is going to get more people watching it. So the big audiences come on the second episode. The first episode, people are going to go, well, I don't know what that is. Science fiction, what is it? And then their friends are going to say, hey, come round, like their neighbour, come in and watch this. Is the most amazing thing. And so they're going to have missed the first episode. So we need a reprise of the first episode. So we need to somehow record it, so that we can show a summary of what happened, dare I use the word, previously, which now, of course, is on the front of every program you watch. Yes. It says previously. Yes. These guys thought this up. So then they discovered that this machine was still operational. Said, fantastic, right, record it. So each episode, they recorded the whole of it. Then a film editor came in, cut it down to 30 seconds. Nigel Neal voiced the reprise himself, what we call it previously. And each episode 4, they record the whole of it. Episode 5, they recorded for episode 6 for the finale. This film still exists in the archive. Episode 6, they didn't record it, because obviously there wasn't an episode 7, so they didn't need a reprise. But it means that Quatermass Experiment, when you buy the DVD or watch it on iPlayer when it's on there, there's only the first 5 episodes. The last episode's missing. Isn't that fantastic? I think that's a great story. Anyway,
a great story,
my parents left for whatever. I think they had to get an aerial on their house. So for whatever reason, I don't know, I was 6. The TV stayed at the factory, went in the office in the factory, and it was all working there. So they would go down on a Saturday night to the office and watch a bit of television.
Right.
And me being 6 would be trailed along. Now, when Quatermass started, this was obviously, they desperately wanted to watch this because it was highly talked about. So they went down there, and on the front of the show, it started off with a caption that said, for young children or those of a nervous disposition, this program is not recommended. So I, at 6 years old, was lifted up and deposited at the other end of the factory where I couldn't see it. For some reason, I was attracted to this, presumably like anybody from about the age of 3 upwards, if you're told not to do something you want. So I got inside a cardboard box. God knows how this works, but I got inside a cardboard box that had holes for, where the handles go, and crawled slowly through the 25 minutes of the show up to the television, and saw the whole of it was uncovered at the end. The following week, the television had been moved home. But somehow, I don't have any memory of what it was like to be 6, but somehow I remembered this. And so I was deposited upstairs when it went out. I think it went out at 6:30 or something. It went out quite early. Our programmes didn't go on till late. And I was found behind the sofa halfway through. And so my parents had, of the second episode, my parents had the dilemma. do we miss the rest of this because they'll all be screaming and crying? We'll have to get him out of the room, and he'll be screaming and banging on the door, and or do we just? He's already seen the whole first episode. He's seen half of this. Do we just let him watch it? Yeah. And my parents let me watch it. Now, this is interesting in that it connects to my BBC chronology, in that I was due to work on Quatermass 4, which the BBC was going to produce, to the extent that I had the white, that is the rehearsal script. And then the production was canned. And the reason was in the original script very diversive and very anti-government. So anyway, the BBC, all the scripts had to be handed back. So that is an amazing connection to me, you know, as a six-year-old, blah, 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 blah. And then later on, you know, when I was about the fifth form or something, and I watched the early Doctor Who's just before I went, I wrote to the BBC. I thought the images in the first Dalek story of the city, them looking down on the Dalek city of the future, was fantastic. And then they wrote back to me and they sent me a photograph of a model, but they said, look, this is something called a composite. This doesn't exist because it only exists in the live television broadcast, because it's electronically combined, actors and the set. I thought it was so interesting that this was another thing that happened in my childhood, and that years later I worked on 61 episodes of Doctor Who, either on cameras or on effects. I mean, no, my interest in effects photography and everything was from, you know, I was interested in photography from very young. And, you know, from watching TV got me enthusiastic about that. But it was all like ITV's Sword of Freedom and For Just Men and the BBC Quatermass. Those all got me interested in photography and television production. And so I took still photographs, and I liked making little models, which I then took photographs of as if they were TV sets. Oh, yes. And, you know, and also, you know, the pop shows, like ITV's predecessor, The Top of the Pops, I made sets like, you know, versions of that. And the other thing was my girlfriend. I mean, I went to a school, and then there was a girl who went to another school nearby that I met, and, you know, was my girlfriend for 2 or 3 years. And her brother was James Weatherup, who was Raymond Cusick's assistant at the BBC as the production designer. And in fact, he was one of the 3 guys that physically built the Daleks. I knew him before that, by the way, but later on. And he became a famous set designer, and he worked on a couple of the shows when I was on the cameras before I'd started doing effects. I worked on a couple of shows that he was on as well. I used to, when I was around at their house, I would be looking at all the photographs and the blueprints for the sets for BBC dramas and Telefiche Éireann Light Entertainment, which by that stage he was working on, I think. Anyway, whatever it was, I used to look at his blueprints and photographs, and that got me interested as well. And I used to then build sets that were a bit like, you know, the pop shows, and I used to photograph those. So I was into that, and in fact, you know, I learned about compositing through a mistake, in that I had a Pelham puppets, and I used to take photographs of the puppets, and I used to build little sets and put the puppets in and take photographs of them. And they had a skeleton, and I had this idea that I wanted to do a creepy one, and so I wanted to superimpose the skeleton and have it transparent. So I photographed this little set, and then I photographed a skeleton which was white against black, on a double exposure. I mean, this was, you know, I couldn't do it. I didn't have post-production. I mean, this was on transparency film. Yeah, so I did I wound the film back and did a second exposure of it and shot it against black. And I was astounded when I got the transparency back, because the skeleton was completely there. I mean, and it wasn't transparent. And I thought, well, what the hell? How's that? I mean, and I started thinking, did I do this? Did I what? And then, you know, it gradually came to me that, well, actually, you know, there's a maximum exposure. And so the background was all a kind of slight exposure, but it was completely blocked out because the white exposure, I'd overexposed it slightly intentionally, and it had burnt its way through. So there was none of the other thing. And I realized, my God, so that's how they put the titles on shows, that they must shoot the title on white on black, and they just superimpose it, which is exactly what they did. But then I started thinking, how the hell do they do it when they've got black titles on the background? You know, and that was that really.
So let's cut a long story short. I mean, this was a lot of very interesting material that made you very interested in getting into television.
That's right.
And then
I applied
you were in
to
Northern
be a
Ireland.
cameraman.
When did you see an advert and then apply for a job?
No, I wrote to the BBC and asked how, I could become a cameraman. And they said, "Do you mean a studio cameraman or a film cameraman?" And I said, "Well, I did a TV cameraman." They sent me the application form for, technical operations, which is how you would become a cameraman. And I filled it in. I'd applied, when I was leaving school, so like in March or whatever for the summer. They had no jobs, but they said, if you're willing to hang around, we are willing to offer you a job at the beginning of next year. And so I got a letter in January or February saying, do you want to go ahead with this? And then I got a letter for March to go to Evesham and do. I joined as a technical operator trainee, which was the same as Bernie Newnham, who is also represented in these talks. And we were both on TO25, which was one of the intakes. In fact, I believe it was the last intake that was to produce more people at the bottom, because everybody was going to be promoted because BBC Two and Colour were going to start. So when they started BBC Two, they obviously needed to almost double their staff. So they needed loads and loads of more people. So they recruited a vast number of people. And TO25 was the last set of operators in that tranche.
This was the mid-60s?
This was 1966.
Right.
The problem was that they'd recruited so many people on all different things. So there was, technical assistants, there was sound people, there were production people, there were all sorts of people who all ended up at Wood Norton, the Evesham Training Centre. So there wasn't room for everybody to have a single room, which was what they tended to do. They had so many people there that they had to double us up. And these were old wartime army places.
Yes, the old Nissen huts.
So there were the Nissen huts that had been part of the wartime emergency transmission suite. Anyway, so Bernie Newnham and I were allocated to share a room, which we did. The course was 5 months. I think we shared a room for about 2 months before it died down. We will have our own rooms.
5 months.
So
that's a long time.
I think it was 5 months.
And during that time, were you covering virtually everything?
Well, it was technical operations. So you did sound, you did vision, and you did camera. And I wanted to be on cameras, as did Bernie. So there were people from outside broadcast, people from radio, people from television. We were all jumbled up, and you did this entire course. And I mean, I was very rickety. There was a whole lot of sound stuff. And I was kind of right on the verge of being, chucked out, because it wasn't only that I wasn't particularly good at it, but the reason I wasn't particularly good at it was I wasn't interested. I didn't join to, I joined to be a cameraman. I didn't want anything to do with sound.
Was it very technical? I mean, was it mathematical?
We did it all. We did the theory. We did all diagrams with resistors and all that sort of stuff. Absolute physics. We did photography, where you had a plate camera and you took photographs. So they gave you a bunch of things. They gave you a cube and a pyramid and a sphere and a bunch of wooden kind of artifacts and a white cyc, and you then had to put them in some sort of composition and light it, and then photograph it with a 6x8 monorail camera, which is genuine photography, nothing to do with television. You learned about camera operation, you learned about sound. They did all sorts of tests, like they tested your eyesight to see, what degree of colorblind you were. I was slightly, but nothing to worry about. I was issued, when color came, I was issued with a pair of tinted specs that corrected. I mean, they did spend a lot of money in those days. Yeah, I got tinted specs that were optically flat because there was nothing wrong with my eyes. They were tinted to account for the degree of colour blindness I had. And, when I first was working in the TV centre, and they were first doing colour, we had those. And the other thing was that if you were working on lighting when colour first came in, you got visors, in Hollywood movies about casinos. and the
Yes.
people dealing the cards quite often wear these
Yes.
visors.
Yes.
We were people that were working on lighting were given those because they were worried about people's eyesight being damaged by the brightness of the lights, and it got very hot because of that bright lighting. I mean, because the cameras, the original Marconi cameras, were very I don't know what the ASA would be, but they were pretty damn slow. So they needed a huge amount of light, and for depth of field as well, to give people a chance of focusing. There was another thing about that was to do with this visors. One of the differences between how the film industry worked and television worked in terms of lighting. So you'd have in the BBC the TM1 who did the lighting, and the movie industry the director of photography who did the lighting. And it was really interesting because I morphed between the two, and I thought I'm one of the only people who've ever spotted this. It was really interesting that in the TV studios, because of the way that you had to work very fast and you used multi-cameras, so therefore the view from any camera with regard to exposure and the lighting, didn't necessarily cover another camera. So if you were to try and look at your lighting from the point of view of all the camera positions, they'd never get the show shot. So the method for real speed that you used in the studio was let's say you're photographing one actor standing in a set. So the lighting director in a TV studio would go and stand where the actor was and look at where the cameras were and look at the lights. And they would look at the lights and they would be able to tell on the Fresnel type lights that the BBC used. Yes. You could see where the spot was, and therefore you could tell where all the light was going, where it would fall off, where the shadows would be. And if you used an exposure meter, then you stood there at that point and you took a reading from that point where the light was falling on you. But in a feature film where the tendency was only to shoot with one camera, and in that case the DOP, the cameraman, would stand at the camera and look towards the set to align the light. So he would stand at the camera and the electrician be on a ladder or whatever, and then he'd get him, drop the barn door, bang, 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 knock the barn door in, put the shadow there. But in the studio, the lighting man would stand by the actor, and he would then look at the dot in the Fresnel and tell the electrician to drop the barn door till it touched the spot that he could see. This meant that they, of course, looked into the lights. And this is why they all had visors, because the lights were so bright and they had to look into them, as opposed to the DOP on a film set that would be looking at the set and therefore his eyes would be all right.
You started in black and white.
When I arrived, 1966, it was black and white, and a lot of shows were live, or if they weren't live, they were recorded as live, because this was still early days for VT.
Yes.
They stopped mostly doing tele-recording, which was the film recording method, but they recorded entire scenes. And quite often they went on until something went so horrendously wrong they had to stop. And then they'd pick up from there.
Yes.
And in fact, on that front, I worked on one of the only shows that used the Editech system, which was the original Ampex VT recording editing system. Okay. And the way this worked was they didn't have editing from one machine to another. So what they would do is they would play back, and at the point where the cut was, it would instantly switch from playing to recording. Now, obviously, this was an unknown point on the studio floor. Yes. I mean, even if you had monitors, it was like, we're talking about, a 25th of a second.
Yes,
so,
right.
So the floor manager couldn't exactly cue the actors. So what they had was a pip of sound that went 1 second before the cut. So you'd all stand in the studio, and then the floor manager would be saying, "Okay, we're coming, 3, 2, beep," and all the actors would start acting, and all the actors had to be kind of frozen in space, and then continue on the scene from where they were, and it would hope to. Now here's the thing: if you did that, and then the actor forgot his lines, or everybody was so horrified somebody dropped a cup, or the set fell apart, or anything, that caused you to do a retake, you'd have to go back to that point, but you'd already eaten into that point.
Oh, yes.
So you then would have to move back slightly so that
To
the
avoid
cut
a
would
jump
be
cut,
before
yes.
the other one.
Yeah.
And so you gradually ate it away. And
Yeah.
in fact, that meant that towards the end, you would be getting into a point where everybody was semi-hysterical because you had one left, and if you didn't do it, you'd be so close to the previous cut that you'd have to go back to the previous cut and start eating away and, start in a pace that maybe wasn't very practical to do it. Now, my ultimate story for that is this was obviously totally impractical, and there were only 3 or 4 shows that ever, we're talking drama here, only 3 or 4 dramas that ever actually got shot that way. And one of them was the original BBC Sherlock Holmes. And we had a scene there where the camera goes in on a clock and locks off. And then they stop recording and they move everything around, blah, 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 blah. And the actors change their clothes and whatever. And they wound the clock on by 2 hours. And then they were able to come back to it and play the original scene and then go back to the clock and then pull out. So anyway, there were 2 takes that failed. And each time the floor manager had to go back and put the clock back to the other position. And what happened was one of the hands fell off the clock. The clock broke because it had been wound forward and backward so many times. So we had to go back and do the whole scene. And that was the producer and director were going totally insanely berserk about this and said this never again. We will never shoot this way again. And that, I think, was the last drama.
That's interesting. I remember there was a Sherlock Holmes program which famously went out unedited, and there was, floor managers running around saying, retakes. And
I remember, I
remember
that. It was because I think that was when they'd started following the disaster I've just described. I think, and I might be wrong in this, that was once they'd started to do post-production edits.
Yes.
Anyway, whatever happened, they went to the wrong edit. They went to an edit that was beyond.
Yes.
And so it meant there was a whole section that should have been edited that wasn't.
Yeah.
That was the reason for it. It was
yes.
by putting an edit in after a sequence that hadn't been edited.
Entertaining for the viewers.
I mean, these things were absolutely phenomenal.
Yes. So black and white, you were at Television Centre, but also at Lime Grove.
And Riverside.
And Riverside.
Yeah, we did all 3. And we did the course, and then you came, so that was just under 6 months. And then you came to the TV centre and you were allocated to a crew. And you got what was called a logbook. This was for cameras. You got a logbook, and this was basically a little book that was full of questions to do with technical stuff. How does a mold crane work? Which was a dolly that they used in the centre, and it had three people: the cameraman on the end of an arm, and a person swinging the arm, and a person driving the motor. So they might ask you, how many people drives a mold crane, and what are the purposes of those 3 people? And so what you did was you had to read through this and find out the answers to questions. And when you thought you were up to speed on, 6 pages, let's say, then you went to senior cameraman, and either he or somebody that he allocated you to for the purpose would go through and ask you these questions. And then as you got each one right to to their level that they considered was enough knowledge, they would initial it. And so you then had 6 months to do this, and at the end of that 6 months, they looked at the senior cameraman's report, the head of cameras comments, your Evesham result and everything. And at that point, you either got because all that time you were a trainee, and at that point they considered all that, and you were recommended to go on to staff or drop off the end. And if you went on to staff, then you got a staff. You had a staff number, but you became what was called substantive staff. You went into a non-trainee production
fund as well.
And you went into the pension fund. Absolutely. That's correctly. So I initially, I was interested in movies. So
Yes.
it was, in BBC terms, drama was what I was interested in. I was initially put on to Stan Appel's Crew 13, which was the LE crew. And I suspect that wasn't by chance, because the camera department didn't like people to think they were specialists. They wanted everybody to think they were a cameraman, and they did whatever they were told, and everybody did everything. Anyway, I went on to Stan Appel's crew, and we were doing international cabaret and something special. It was all things like the Kathy Kirby show, because in those days cabarets in the West, the Hippodrome and places like that, were all still a big thing, and variety still existed, and that was mainly at the TV theatre, which was the Shepherd's Bush Empire originally, and became the BBC's TV theatre. So anyhow, I worked on that, and we did all those shows, and I was on that crew for 3 months or 6 months, I can't remember. That was where I was the trainee, and through that I met Stuart Morris, which became relevant when I went on to doing effects, which was the main thing I did.
Just go back a bit. I mean, this is pre-colour.
Yep.
So visual effects were almost non-existent, presumably, in those days. They were mixes and what have you.
There's a parallel with the video effects, let's call them, to be generic, which is not what they called them originally. The video and what later became digital effects was parallel to the radiophonic workshop, and people were only allowed to work there for 3 months because they didn't want it to turn into some sort of empire. And the same thing happened with special effects. In the 1950s, they did have special photographic effects, if you like to call it that. And they had a few people that became really expert at this in doing composite photography, where, you had a model and you had the actors, and you dropped the actors into the model by, mirrors or whatever, or some electronic means. But the thing was, this was at the period when the whole superstructure, when the BBC started to become a big thing. And so then you had politics coming in about who would run the studio and who'd be the boss technically. And that was, they'd originally been, a lighting director and a technical operation manager called a Tom. And eventually there was a fight, for power between these individuals. And the special effect guy was up there going to planning meetings with directors and producers in amongst that. And that was seen as somebody who, could be in complete control, because it was all so complicated. So in this battle, they lost out. And basically you got the lighting director, if you like, won. And so you had this superstructure with a technical manager 1 who did the lighting, and a technical manager 2, the operation manager that sat at the end of the desk
in the gallery,
and ran VT machines and all that sort of thing. That was that power structure, and the special effect guy didn't fit into this at all. And basically, this was a power thing. So the TM wanted to be the person calling the shots. He had to be in charge. The TM1 had to be in charge of everything, and he was over the TM2, obviously. So therefore, he, through that means, had control of the VT running and the vision mixer and everything, and was in charge of everything, in charge of all the electricians. He was the highest paid, the highest nobility, if you like, of the technical organization, and in fact was the equal to the producer in terms of BBC grades. And in fact, the TM1 could stop the show. It was the only other person, the producer and the TM1 both had the capability of closing the show down for some reason. Like, the director's not capable of doing this show, so we're not wasting any more money. And which did happen on a show I was on, where the TM1 actually turned all the lights off. He kept saying, we have to finish now. We haven't got a show and we have to finish. And the director said, I've just got one more shot. And the TM turned all the lights off, and that was it. So what happened was they obviously still needed somebody to operate the special effect equipment. There was certain places had to, like Studio G in Lime Grove, had this Fernseh installation. My God, there was every conceivable wipe. You could you could control the sine wave, or it was a sine wave that you made straight, but you could turn the knob and it would become more and more of a sine wave.
Yes.
And so you could have wiggly wipes. You could have them moving, and because this is all black and white, it was very easy. You could make triangles. You could do anything. And they had a little camera. They had a little black and white camera. And then you could make it had a light box under it. And so if it was white, you had camera A, and if it was black, you had camera B. So then you could have it white, you're on camera 1, and let's say this is Top of the Pops, and you want some sexy, kind of strange, weird, wipe, you pour cornflakes onto it. I mean, that was one of the things they did. Pour cornflakes on it, and you get a completely random sputtering out of one picture into another. And this, and this was a way of doing it live, because the thing is, you had to do it live. So there had to be methods you could do. If you wanted to do a wipe using that, but it was so if you wanted a straight line that had a zigzag on it, get a bit of cardboard, cut a zigzag out, then you put the black cardboard on top of the light box so that it's blanking it all out. Cut to special effects. Camera 2 is on it blanked out. You pull the card away. It's got a zagged edge on one side, and that fractured zigzag edge pulls across and reveals the other camera. Right. That was how. So there was special effects. Anyway, somebody had to operate this, and obviously it couldn't be the TM1 or TM2, because the TM2 was
kind of busy.
Had a pair of headphones on and was starting VTs and run Telecine and all that sort of stuff. The TM1 was in a separate gallery looking at the pictures and making sure that all the cameras had decent pictures. So so they still had to have somebody. So they invented the job of inlay operator. And the inlay operator was a camera assistant who did this for 3 months, and you were not allowed to do it for longer. And this was still in black and white. When I was an assistant, I was always interested in the effectsy type things. So this seemed kind of interesting and worth a do. So anyway, I did it the first time for the 3 months, and and I might have done, I can't remember, I might have done one episode of Doctor Who. But anyway, I met Barry Letts, who was the producer of Doctor Who. And on the second time round, I then did do effects inlay on a Doctor Who, and got friendly with Barry Letts. And at this point, colour came in. And so colour changed everything, because suddenly, instead of these horrific luminance keys, because when you wanted to drop an actor into another set, you either had to have the actor against a white background or a black background. And you'd use luminance key. And of course, if it was a black background, then when he opened his mouth, that was a problem. And if it was a white background, then if it was a Caucasian actor, they obviously had white skin, or certainly had white, and whether they were Caucasian or black or whatever, they would have white teeth. So this was very problematic. But as soon as you went into colour, you could use a blue or a yellow or a green screen, then that would work for any actor, all the way from an Asian to the darkest Caribbean. Skin tone would work on blue. Apart from Caribbean ladies who have blue pigment. On Blake 7, in regard to skin tones, there was this genius lighting man, Brian Clement, and I remember him explaining to me that Josette Simon, who was played one of the 7, and was a Caribbean actress, and she was very young. She was straight out of drama school. She had the most beautiful skin, and he said, well, of course, there's always problems in dark skin, making it stand out, particularly if if the playing in the set is dark. So he said, but it only works with Caribbean females, but they have blue pigment in their skin, and so when he lit scenes with her in it, he put a light blue gel on backlights, and always made sure there was kickers, which are side backlights, with blue gel on them on her. And if you look at those recordings, she looks astounding. She stands out. She looks absolutely, totally amazing. And that is through his absolute genius lighting, that he knew to do that, which meant it lifted the skin without changing the tone of it. It was very clever, and you can look back on them, and in those days where the cameras had a very limited dynamic range, I mean, it was tricky if you had black and white actors together. I mean, if it was just one actor on their own, then you could sort that out. But the point was you're using multiple cameras, and the actors mixed up, and then it becomes very difficult because there wasn't a dynamic range. On a modern digital camera, there's not a problem at all. I mean, it's absolutely, fantastic. And you look at something like Luther, and it's absolutely stunning photography, and everybody looks great, not least the lead part. We're talking about the originals of inlay. So,
yes. Where did the inlay operator operate from?
They had a desk in the gallery. That was where this. They had a little rostrum camera, and then they had a switching desk. Inlay was the generic term for the whole thing, because you had a switch, a very, very fast switch. And basically the way it operated was it had three inputs. There was one input was for one side, let's say the black side, and there was one side, one camera for the other side, which was the B side. So that would be white if you were using the light box. And then you had a third input, which was the thing that causes you to switch. That would be your three things. You'd one side of the picture, the other side of the picture, and something switching between them. Now, if you made one of those the same as the thing that you switched between, that was called overlay. And then that was where you would have an actor against a white background, let's say. If the image is white, it goes to camera A, and if the image is black, it goes to camera B, but camera B is the switch. So therefore, you get the actor that is in front of the white screen goes into the hole. Now, when they came into colour and they started to use blue to discriminate, then they called it colour separation overlay. And because they'd always had overlay and patents or proof that they'd had it working, then it meant when the NBC patents on chroma key, which was electronic blue screen, came along, the BBC were able to argue they had prior demonstration because they called it colour separation overlay, which was just a different application of their overlay process, which they'd had from the early 50s, and therefore they didn't have to pay their patent license.
How interesting.
And that's why, and it became known as CSO.
Yes, I wondered why there were two terms for it.
Yeah. So that comes back from what we were talking about, the black and white origins were the inlay machine, and then the overlay was the combination of the two. So I'd met Barry Letts on the black and white Doctor Who and got friendly with him at the point when it went into colour. And so Barry Letts was very technical. I mean, he'd been an actor, but for some reason he just loved tech. And he was really into using effects. And he saw Doctor Who, which he was a producer of, as something that could really use this and make it into proper science fiction. So he grabbed this with both hands. And I happened to be, an inlay operator that was there at that time, at the point when it went colour. And so we started to cook up really complicated things. And he then went to, I was, halfway through my 3 months, so I was about to go. And I actually liked it, and I wanted to, you could see the development. And we both together were very excited by this and the possibility. So anyway, Barry Letts then went and put forward some insanely complicated article that was some paper that was so complicated nobody could read it, and kept going on about it so much that they all just was like, get this ghastly man off my shoulder. So he managed to inveigle them into allowing me to do a second term immediately, which would run me into doing 6 months, so that I could do the whole of one of these Pertwee shows that we'd set up. Now, this was a very short period where it actually went yellow. For a very short period of time, yellow became better than blue. So this Doctor Who, going back to that, where I worked with Barry Letts, we were on yellow. And it was in the days of John Pertwee was Doctor Who. And so there's one season where you'll see a yellow line around him all the time. And we did really complicated things. We had a forklift truck that was completely covered with yellow cloth, and Pertwee standing on the front of it and driving that around in front of a huge yellow screen to make him float around. And so at the end of that 6 months, but by now I'd done 9 months, which nobody else had ever even done.
Yes.
But the point was, I had become interested enough and enthusiastic that it just didn't work. I mean, this was, and the point was I was becoming more senior at that point, so more likely, as a camera assistant, I was getting to operate a camera more frequently, and so at the end of the 6 month, I dropped back, and at that stage, I went on to a drama crew that I liked being on, a senior cameraman called Bob Baxter, and that was great. He did kitchen sink type drama, which was perfect for me. I loved it, and so I just decided, that was it. But what I did was I wrote a paper suggesting that with the coming of colour, things were more complicated, and they really ought to invent a real job, a permanent job of special photographic effects, and that they could have 3 people, put them on the camera pool, so that if there wasn't any effects, they could work on doing cameras, which would keep their hand in for doing cameras anyway. And then it meant that it was flexible, and then when there was a big complicated show that needed planning, these guys could be dragged on to that and do that. So I put this in as a management suggestion, and it disappeared, and that was that. And I went back to cameras, and I gradually moved up, and I spent most of my time with Bob, and Bob put me on cameras even when I was an assistant, and I eventually got up to being a camera operator substantive. It was actually my paid job as opposed to being an assistant who was acting, and this was cool. At which point, and this is like 3 or 4 years later, it had gone through all the echelons of bureaucracy, and they decided to do it. But with a difference, that it would be a permanent job, wouldn't be camera pool person, it would be a permanent job with its own title. It would be in the vision department. That is to say, the department where the TM1 was. So, it's still maintaining that order. So now this is a person who's back kind of at planning meetings and things. But what they've done is they put him into the department that is run by the TM1. The camera department was separate. There was a camera department, a sound department, and a vision department. TM1 and 2, and the vision operators who did the exposure on cameras were all in that. So they put it in there, which was, fair enough, clever. It what meant was, in the politics of the time, it was a compromise method of doing it. So they created the job, but they call it electronic effects. Yes. And we all said that didn't seem like a good idea, because really it would get confused with electronic music. And they said, yes, but in the BBC, electronic music is called radiophonic. So it's not, and it couldn't be called visual effects, because our special prop, explosive, pyrotechnics, special effects in the modern sense of the world, that was called visual effects. Yes. So they couldn't use that term. So we were called electronic effects. Anyway, I was called, everything in those days, all jobs were advertised. And this was pretty amazing. I was called up and told these jobs were going on the board. I should really think about applying for it. It was my idea, and here's a great opportunity. Yeah. But it was up to me whether I did or not. But they were just saying, be aware of this. And so I was in a real quandary, because now, I'd always wanted, from I was a schoolboy, I wanted to be a TV cameraman, and I was one. And now I just, literally been made up by 6 months before to the substantive job, and I genuinely was that, and I could put it on my passport as my job or whatever. And suddenly I'm being offered this job that isn't a cameraman. So I asked to see head of cameras, was a man called Dave Bull, to see what he said and get, for some sort of advice from a kind of person with a big global overview. And, nobody ever, he sat in some office on the 6th floor in the TV centre, and we dealt with camera managers, we'd never even see him. Anyway, and he, to my surprise, he invited me up, and I, like you did, offered me a coffee and a biscuit, and I said, well, I'm in a real dilemma here, I've always wanted to be a cameraman, and I'm now of the possibility of this. And he said, well, I have a very strong opinion about this. He said, the thing is, let's face it, you are a person who isn't as great a team player as everybody might be. You have your ideas, you're very keen, you're very excited by this stuff, and you really like it, you really want to, and you want to stand out, and you want to be known for being an expert at something. Feedback from the camera crews is directors are always sort of saying, oh, can we have him, blah, 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 because you kind of push yourself and do a lot of PR, and that's your kind of personality. And he said, so the fact is, that's not, of course, as you know, that's not what we want in the camera department. We want in the camera department to be, behind closed walls. I have to say, numbers, you're all numbers. And we want to be able to allocate everybody to everything. And we don't really like having crews that are specialists, which of course we do, but we don't like it. And we don't want people to be specialists. And you actually want that. And so this is a new job with no proper definition of what the job is. It's completely new. It's never existed before. There's 3 people going to do it and 1 manager, and the 4 of you can invent whatever job you want. It's completely up to you, and you can become as famous as you like, and nobody's going to object to it, because that is actually the whole idea of it. So I would say this is the ideal job for you and you should take it. So I came out of that meeting slightly horrified, and I took the job. And the reason I took the job wasn't really for his argument there. It was the horror of the fact that, there was the head of cameras telling me, you're all just numbers, you're just numbers on a card. And that therefore in that camera department, we were never, you were never going to be able to get to be officially a drama cameraman or a light entertainment cameraman or whatever, or to officially get a situation where you always worked on Doctor Who or what. Yeah. So I took that job. And so I immediately became one of the first 3 electronic effects operators, Dave Jervis and Dave Chapman being the other 2, and Bob Wright, who was getting older and sort of heading towards retirement, pretty well the best, or one of the best lighting directors they'd had in the early days, who was really into effects and, was a kind of thinks off the top of his head type of person as well. So that was absolutely fantastic.
Apart from something like Doctor Who, where you can obviously see where you would want special effects or electronic effects, or what other sorts of programs were using you?
When I worked with Stan Appel, I got to know Stuart Morris, who was an infamous kind of monster, bully, kind of crazy person. And I don't mean this, by the way, in an insulting way at all. I mean in the best possible way. I mean, he was a lunatic in the best possible way. And I mean, he did. I mean, he was a kind of over-the-top person, and he did fire people over the top back. And I did work on shows where he screamed, "You're fired, get out of the studio," on a live show at his assistant, which was obviously not practical, because then there'd be no floor manager. Anyway, I mean, it was absolutely fantastic. And he did scream. And in fact, on YouTube, if you look up Stuart Morris, you can find recordings of the talkback of some of his shows where God knows how somebody managed to get them all these years after. But and so I knew Stuart Morris, and he, of course, was an innovator and always wanted to do experimental and try new types of shows. And he saw these French shows by some producer I don't remember the name of, that used chroma key for everything. I mean, it was basically like a TV version of Busby Berkeley. And Stuart thought this was absolutely fantastic and decided to do a series that featured 2 or 3 numbers in each show that were completely done using CSO or chroma key, blue screen. And it was called The Magical Music Machine. Mm-hmm. And there was 1 season of it. There might have been a 2nd season I didn't work on, but it was, anyway, we did 1 season, and these were really complicated. They all had to be storyboarded. They were really, really tricksy. And they were kind of, if you like, slightly Busby Berkeley kind of numbers that Stuart produced. And these took a lot of planning. I mean, there were 3 or 4 days planning for the 2-day shoot. And they were mostly done the TV theatre, used blue screen, they used hand-drawn mats, they did everything. And they were really complicated. And through him then, I worked on Blankety Blank, which was another Ellie show that had, used blue screens. Then there was, out of Stuart Morris, there were other people I met. So I worked on things like Monty Python, which had lots of visual effects in them. And then because of the director of that, I moved on to doing the Q, Spike Milligan shows. And then one that was really complicated and we were really proud of, and I've never found any copies of these. We did a series of Mike Yarwood's where there was 1 season which was an ex-boom operator, so a very technical guy, whose name I've now forgotten, although I see his image. He was directing these and decided that it would be fun to do multi-screens. And, you know, by this stage, this wasn't to do with CSO, although we did use it a bit. This was to do with the fact we were now in a position to play back VTs. So we could record a scene and then we could play it back and re-record it. And there wouldn't, you know, be much visible difference. You wouldn't see the line because of the huge difference in the quality. And so we did multi-screens, and we used to work. The thing is, on 2-inch VT, each time you re-recorded, the quality went down. So you had to be very careful to match the quality as you did this. We had a quiz show where there were 4 contestants, all of whom were played by Mark Yarwood, 2 males and 2 females. Right. And so what we would do is we would record him in the left-hand seat, and in whatever makeup it was, and he'd play that part, and we'd record everything, and then he would go off and get remade up as let's say the lady that was sitting next to that male, and then he would sit in the second seat, and we would then put a wipe, and on the left-hand side of the wipe we'd have the person on the left, and then on the right-hand side we'd have the live picture. Sure. Yeah. But because of the generations problem, you wouldn't just keep doing that. So that would be the first run. And then what you would do is he'd go and get changed again. Let's say we put him in the far right. We make a new recording, not a composite. We make a new recording with the first recorder of him playing that. He goes off, gets made up. We put a wipe across between him and the new character. So we've got on the right of the right is VT, and on the left is the whole picture. We would then, so those 2 tapes now, we've got 2 tapes, both of which have a second generation. Yeah. We would then play both of those back with a wipe between them to make the 4 characters in a third generation.
Yes. But
so it was one less generation, but they would be the same quality all the way through.
That's very clever. Yes,
so that was those. So our electronic effects, inverted commas, you know, they weren't just that. But so we did, you know, quite a few light entertainment things. Those are the main ones that you would mention. But my personal interest was drama. I did 40 episodes of Doctor Who. I did the whole of Blake 7 up to Blake wasn't in it. So the first 3, so 39 episodes. And then I did single dramas, which were, you know, my main interest. And I worked with the director, Philip Saville, and I basically worked on all his productions. So we did a version of Dracula with Louis Jourdan playing Dracula, which was pretty amazing. It was with Philip. It was so popular, and you know, it was so successful, and it sold abroad so well, having Louis Jourdan in. I mean, it was really excellent. BBC immediately, you know, production wanted another one, so they did Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Then Philip did a Philip, and got all of us that normally worked with him to agree to working on it, and then for some reason or other decided he wasn't going to do it and left. But a director, Alistair Reid, came along, who was absolutely stunning director, and you know, I really loved him, and it was just one of my best experiences working with him. And funnily enough, the first time I met him was when he suddenly replaced the director, and the last time I ever saw him was when he was replaced by directors.
What sort of time period are we talking about now?
Electronic effects I worked on from 76. We started sometime in 76, and I stayed until late 1980, at which point I left. And that year we did a massive thing. So Philip Saville, other ones, we did the Journal of Bridget Hitler, otherwise known as The Trial of Bridget Hitler. We did something called Annie Besant. Earlier on, I'd worked on operas as well, but they'd stopped doing those by the time I was doing it full time. But I worked on The Flying Dutchman and Owen Wingrave in my early days.
Well, all that experience sounds amazing, but what made you in the end decide to leave the BBC?
Basically, they overtrained me for the resources and budgets that they had. They lifted me to a level where I couldn't do the things I was thinking of doing and wanting to do. It was a big frustration for me. I mean, I remember going with the producer. Barry Letts eventually was replaced by Graham Williams as the producer on Doctor Who. And I remember going with Ian Scoons and a whole bunch of guys with Graham Williams to a private screening of Star Wars when that came out, that was 78. And compared with Doctor Who, what was hilarious was that Graham was saying it's got a lot of kind of Hollywood money on it, but the fact of the matter is the script isn't any better than our script. In fact, our scripts are better than that. Yes. And then also, for all the laser guns shooting off all around the place, our lasers at least actually, go to where the people are and hit them. And those lasers just flying randomly put on top of the shots. And I remember thinking, well, Graham, I mean, honestly, how can you be saying this? I mean, look beyond that. Yes. I mean, look, this is just unbelievable. All those models and the way they've been integrated together is just unbelievable. Yeah. And I'm thinking, shit. And yeah, we were all discussing how you would do all this. And, we knew how the stuff was done. And I mean, we show some of the Doctor Who's, the film model sequences like Ian Scoons and some of the guys there down at Western Avenue Visual Effects were shooting with people like Nicky Older, and Nicky Older did all the effects photography on Alien. We were using the same people, so we were limited by those budgets. We were limited by the amount of time we had. And the thing was, towards the end, I'd been headhunted, and I was kind of advising a commercials company called James Garrett and Partners. I was doing consultancy with them for some commercials where they were doing complicated chroma keys and stuff. So I then, having done that, obviously on those consultancy, had gone on set a few times, and then I saw the way that they worked. And I was like, it's a different world. Yeah, and Peter Hammond, who was their lighting man, director of photography, I mean, lit things in a completely different way from we'd been taught in the BBC, and had more time, had more resources. I mean, the whole thing was just absolutely incredible. So they basically trained me to the point where they no longer had the resources to do what I wanted to do. I mean, in Blake 7, when we did the teleport mechanism, and we had the teleport thing, and it had to be a hand-drawn mat. I mean, this was like if they shot stuff on location on 16mm. So the method we used had to not be reliant on having a blue screen or whatever. It had to be done when the actor was in the real set. So the only way you could do that was with a hand-drawn mat. Now, what we had to do on Blake 7 was all the actors had to freeze, and when they were going to be hit, somebody would yell cue and they'd freeze. And that was the point where we could then draw a mat around it and cause the effect. Yeah. And by this stage, 1-inch format was just coming in. And on 1-inch format, you could move the tape one frame at a time. So it would be possible to do a hand-drawn travelling mat. The BBC budget, there was no way that you could do that. You could do it for one frame, and that was it. So I went and worked at a company called Moving Picture Company in its early days, and you're old enough, you may remember the no FT, no comment ads, where the newspaper was pink and everything else was black and white, and that's how we did it. That was the first time I got to do what we developed for Blake 7 but didn't have the budget to do, and that was draw a frame for every frame for however number of seconds it was. And so on that ad it was shot out on locations, on video, in colour, and then what we did was we turned it into black and white. We made a VT of it in black and white, and then we hand drew the newspaper frame by frame, which was hundreds of drawings. The same way exactly as we described for, back in the days in Lime Grove when we were dropping cornflakes onto the white box to create a wipe into black. So we had a light box with a camera looking at it, and a piece of a tracing paper, and then a monitor that you could see the composite, and then we filled out the newspaper, and frame by frame we did that, and then we recorded it frame by frame, and then we used that as a travelling mat to put the colour original video into the black and white copy that we'd made, and that's how you got no FT, no comment. And that is, and the BBC inspiration, if you like, for all those came all the way through down, through the years.
I'm going to say thank you now. Thank you very much for doing this.
It's a pleasure. Love it, as you can tell. It's great.
Absolutely. I might run it at full length.